This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. If you click on the link in the description below, it'll take you to their store and they'll know I sent you there. Hello everyone, I'm Nitsa Hone, and it is Wednesday, so that means it's time for another MTG Top 10. If you live in the United States, you're probably celebrating Thanksgiving tomorrow, and I thought that meant it was a good time to take a look at the color pie because, people eat pie at Thanksgiving. I of course did a video about the color pie earlier this month, and only after the fact did I think, I probably should have saved that for Thanksgiving, but luckily there are lots of different videos we can do about the color pie. Last time I looked at what I considered the most egregious color pie breaks in the game. As a reminder, the color pie visualizes the strengths and weaknesses and also the flavor of each of the colors in the game. Each color represents something different and thus also does different things mechanically. Just as some quick examples, green is the color most focused on nature and is the best at producing mana as a result. Black is the color of decay and death and thus is the best at destroying creatures. So on and so forth. A color pie break, like I talked about last time, is when the color pie is completely ignored and a card does something that no other card or very few other cards in its color can do. In this video, I want to talk about color pie bends or bleeds as they are sometimes called. These are instances where a card might be doing something that seems a little bit off for its color, but I think when we look at the cards on this list more closely, it's clear that the cards aren't actually quite a color pie break, but a bend. In other words, for bends or bleeds, the effect on the card fits within the color flavorfully and mechanically once you look at it more closely. Many of the cards on this list are cards that I've seen others describe as color pie breaks, but obviously I disagree, and think all of these cards manage to stay within their slice of the color pie, if only just barely. Obviously, this list is based on my own opinion about cards, and some people will argue that some of the cards I'm going to discuss are color pie breaks, but that's what comments are for. Let me know what you agree or disagree with down there. At number 10, I have Delver of Secrets. This is a card I think some people don't think of as a color pie bleed, bend, or break, but I think people should. Sure, Delver of Secrets likes instants and sorceries, something that fits into the blue slice of the color pie just fine, but if looked at another way, we're talking about a 1-mana 3/2 flyer. Blue is the least creature-oriented color in the game, and very rarely gets highly efficient creatures for the lower part of the curve, but that is exactly what the Delver does, and for that reason, I definitely think it is a bend. I think it is kept from being a straight-up break because of the flavor of the card and its design. I already mentioned that the instant and sorcery part is very blue, but so is the flavor of the card, which focuses on an individual who is obsessed with expanding his knowledge to the point that he is experimenting on himself and turning himself into, an insectile aberration. And since he does this when he looks at instants or sorceries on top of your library, the card does feel blue overall. There's a pursuit of knowledge there, and that's important. Of course, it is kind of annoying that blue happens to have one of the best one-drop creatures in the entire game. At number 9, I have Stone Giant. The Giant does one thing that doesn't make a lot of sense for red. He can give creatures flying. Red does not get many cards that have flying on their own, only green gets fewer, and red almost never has the ability to give a creature flying. But the design and flavor of this card works pretty well for red, and I think it's a way to let red give a card with flying that fits directly in their color pie. The idea here is that this Giant is picking up one of your creatures and giving it flying that they pay the ultimate price for by being sacrificed at the end of turn. In other words, it's not really flying, it's that this Giant is chucking one of your creatures. Red sacrificing creatures for an advantage is very red, as is giving a creature a bonus that kills them at the end of their turn. It plays right into red's aggressive bent, even if this card goes about it in sort of a weird way. At number 8, I have Floodgate, a card I've seen lots of people say is a color pie break. And yeah, it's a pretty weird card for blue, mostly because it can do damage to the whole board. But I would argue that the way this card works does fall into the blue color pie, especially since the color pie back when Mirage was released was a little different. For one thing, blue being able to do damage to creatures wasn't that odd, with cards like Prodigal Sorcerer being around. For another thing, blue had, and still has to some extent, an Island Matters theme, and Floodgate plays into that. This is the most prevalent on cards with the now-defunct Island Home mechanic, and Floodgate seems to really have been designed with those types of decks in mind, since it doesn't do damage to your blue creatures, which makes sense, because they're not worried about a flood. It also makes perfect sense in terms of flavor that the gate does an amount of damage related to the number of islands you control, since if you don't have enough islands, what are you going to be flooding your opponent with? So I think the fact that blue used to be able to do damage and blue used to have a big focus on Islands Matter means that Floodgate actually falls within the blue slice of the color pie. At number 7, I have Chaos Warp, which is one of the more contentious ones on this list. Mark Rosewater is on record saying he thinks that this card is a color pie break. His reasoning is that Chaos Warp gives red the capability to deal with any type of permanent, with the fact that it can go after enchantments being the biggest problem. Red isn't supposed to be able to do things about enchantments, and obviously his opinion carries some serious weight, but I disagree with him here. I think Chaos Warp is more of a bend. Why? Because red is the color of, well, chaos. And it isn't like this is just a straight up Vindicate type effect for red. The person who casts Chaos Warp is actually going down a card, since the opponent gets to put something into play from the top of the library in most cases. In other words, Chaos Warp is a 2-for-1 for its caster. That's not exactly efficient. Sure, most of the time when you have to use this card, you're getting rid of one of the best cards in your opponent's deck, and chances are good that they just flip a land. But you know as well as I do, if you've cast this card a few times, that sometimes wacky things happen and you end up hurting yourself because of the randomness of Chaos Warp. Over the years, red has had some other chaotic spells that do something similar. Warp World, for example, which basically Chaos Warps the whole board. But guess what? It can get rid of enchantments too, just like Warp World. Anyway, that's my argument for why Chaos Warp is a bend, not a break. It makes sense in red because of its randomness, which gives it some serious limitations. At number 6, I have Seed Time, which in some ways is a stand-in for all kinds of color hosing cards. Color hosers frequently do things that seem odd for the color, but I actually think that makes sense. With Seed Time, for instance, it lets you take an extra turn. Green doesn't do that, right? Well, right, but this card hates on blue, the color that is the best at taking extra turns and an enemy color for green. It makes sense that green mages would develop a way to take extra turns against their most hated enemies in the very specific situation of going up against a blue mage who keeps interfering with what they are doing. For that reason, I think that color hosers like Seed Time actually adhere to the ideas of the color pie perfectly. At number 5, I have Artifact Blast, which is a red counterspell. Those aren't supposed to happen, and that's mostly true, but I think this is narrow enough that it makes sense in red and is just a color pie bend rather than a break. Red hates artifacts and is the best color in the game at destroying them, so it sort of makes sense that red would also be able to counter spells of that particular type. And sure, the card has now been color shifted into blue, and it probably makes more sense there, but I think giving red the ability to occasionally counter artifacts does make sense within the color pie. At number 5, I have Molten Influence and Skull Scorch. I have both of them here because they are both capable of doing things that don't seem very red. Molten Influence can counter spells, and Skull Scorch can make your opponent discard cards. Red is breaking the color pie and doing things here that blue and black are supposed to be doing respectively, right? Well, not really. If either of these cards just straight up did those things, yeah, that would be a huge color pie break, but that's not how they work. They offer your opponent a choice, one which involves doing damage to them, which is very red, and the other which involves an effect that is not typically red. Basically, Molten Influence is a bad counterspell and Skull Scorch is a bad discard spell. Bad because your opponent will always choose the option that matters the least for them. But red mages like doing damage quickly, so the idea here is that you put your opponent in a bind where they have to choose between a dangerously low life total and a pretty powerful effect. Odyssey Block had several other red cards like this, and I think they're pretty cool. Basically, these cards are saying the only way a red mage can potentially have effects like this is to threaten the opponent that they're going to do a bunch of damage to them. That's kind of what we have going on Flavorfully, and that makes a lot of sense. I actually would like to see more red cards with this design, and actually, we recently got another one in Risk Factor, which, similar to these, does something that red doesn't do. It just straight up draws cards, but only after making your opponent decide what actually happens. It may be an indicator that this is going to be something more established within red slice of the color pie going forward, but now these types of effects are still bends because they do some pretty odd stuff. At number 3, I have Core Cartographer, which is a white creature that can ramp your mana. That doesn't seem right, does it? Well, no, in a lot of ways it doesn't. But I think Core Cartographer goes a long way towards showing how the color pie can vary a little bit from set to set, depending on the flavor and setting. Core Cartographer is from Zendikar, a set that was very much focused on lands and giving you bonuses for putting them into play. And because that's such a big part of that plane, it makes sense that the emphasis bled into colors where you might not traditionally see that kind of effect. And really, if any color other than green is going to care about lands, it makes sense that it is white, because there are cards like Land Tax, Knight of the White Orchid, and Weathered Wayfarer, which have already established that white can do stuff with lands when the situation is right. So, when the cartographer can grab you a plains no matter what, it is doing something novel for white, but it isn't a huge leap, and it makes sense in Zendikar. It is sort of like how green is supposed to basically never get dragons or flying, but Tarkir has several flying dragons in green because that block is all about dragons. So yeah, the color pie can change a little bit from set to set and result in the creation of a card like the cartographer, and it is certainly a color pie bend, but it's the kind that I think is really good for the game. At number 2, we have Song of the Dryads, which is a green removal spell. Green isn't supposed to get those, short of fight-type effects that ask you to have a big creature in play, but I still think Song of the Dryads stays within green's slice of the color pie, albeit just barely. Green is the color that is the most obsessed with lands. There are lots of green cards out there that let you search your library for lands, put them into play from your graveyard, put extra lands into play. I mean, green even likes to turn lands into creatures. Green also gets some cards that let you transform creatures into another kind of creature, like Lignify. So, is it really that much of a stretch to make a green card that turns a creature into a land? I don't think it is when you look at all of that. It isn't like this is just a straight up green pacify type effect. Green shouldn't be able to do that, but turning a creature into a land, yeah, I'm okay with that from time to time. And at number 1, I have Form of the Dragon. I think this one comes in at number 1 because it's such a weird card and one of the most interesting designs in the entire game. It makes very little sense for red, the color that is very much focused on aggression, to be doing things that keep the opponent from attacking, but that's exactly what Form of the Dragon does. It does what Moat does. It stops non-flying creatures from attacking. How does that make any sort of sense for a red card? Also, how many red cards are there that set your life total to a particular number? Not really any of them other than this, so why is this a red card? Well, once you put the other pieces of the card together, it becomes a little more clear. The flavor of the card is that it transforms you, the player, into a dragon. You become a 5/5 flyer, and for that reason, your opponent can only get at you with flyers. That's also why your life goes to 5, and it's also why your life resets every turn, the same way the damage on a creature does. And it's also why you can do 5 damage every turn, because you are a 5 power creature. Turning stuff into dragons is a red effect. It's something we've seen appear on some versions of Sarkhan, among other things, and doing something like that certainly fits into the red part of the color pie. The individual parts of the card may not seem red, but altogether they make for a very red card. Well, that does it for this MTG Top 10. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. If you want to make sure you catch future MTG Top 10s, don't forget to subscribe. And if you want to see the over 220 MTG Top 10s I've already done, you should see the playlist on your screen shortly. Thanks for watching.